So, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Mononkatuk Audubon Society, and we're really excited to present this program tonight live from Australia, where it is tomorrow already. Before we get started, let me just mention that next Tuesday we'll be going a little bit closer to home to Brooklyn, New York, birding the Brooklyn Bridge Park. And then in March, we've got two programs. The first is Members Night, and we're looking for people to send us some photos, 5 to 8 photos that we can share with the group. We'll also have an update on the bird atlas, and we'll have a bird quiz. And then at the end of the month, Jerry Connolly will be joining us to tell us about his trip to Namibia and Botswana. But tonight, we've got a follow-up to our fundraiser that we did a year and a day ago, where we raised money to help support the recovery efforts after the, well, actually, it was still during the horrific bushfires in Australia last year. And we thought it would be a great time to get an update from somebody that we've known for quite a few years. She used to work in Greenwich for Audubon, and now she's working in Australia for Greening Australia, and that is Michelle Frankel. She's she leads the Greening Australia Community Conservation and Social Impacts Initiative, and she's well qualified to do that. She worked with in Audubon, Connecticut. She worked as the Greenwich Center director and as the lead for the Bird Friendly Communities program in Connecticut. So she's gone from Bird Friendly Communities in Connecticut to Bird Friendly Communities in Australia. She's been working at this for 25 years in the US, Israel, and now in Australia. And she's joined by one of her colleagues at Greening Australia, Samantha Craigie. She's the Project Phoenix manager, which is a strategic program to build and secure native seed and plant supply for restoration after the devastating Black Summer bushfires. Before that, she played a major role in the development of Greening Australia's Western Sydney seed production area and represents Greening Australia in the Australian Seed Bank Partnership. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree and is working in seeds since 2001. And at this point, I will turn it over to Michelle and Samantha. And Michelle, you want to share your screen? And
yeah, actually, Sam is going to share her screen, but Sam is going to share her screen.
Okay.
And then, but I'm gonna speak for a few minutes and start us off, and then pass it on to Sam. Thank you so much, Dennis, and yeah, thank you for organizing all of this, and thank you all for joining us this evening, this morning for us. It's really a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you all and to see some familiar faces and reconnect with my Audubon family. I'm just going to start us off by giving a brief overview of what we're going to speak about today. Sam is going to start by sharing her own experiences at the front lines of battling the bushfires. Sam's not only an accomplished ecologist, but she's also a passionate and fierce volunteer firefighter. And I can say that as an American, I've been very struck by the bravery and the selflessness of the volunteer firefighters here that protect their communities and the wildlife here in Australia. And I thought it would be really interesting for you all to hear that, that kind of firsthand perspective on the bushfires from last year. So Sam will start us off, and then I'll review some of what we know so far about the impacts on wildlife of the bushfires and some of the recovery strategies that are being put into place. And then Sam and I will both share a few of the programs that Greening Australia has launched in response to the bushfires and the growing threat of climate change. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sam.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you to everyone so much for the invitation to speak with you all today, our time, tonight, your time. It really is a great delight to be able to share our stories. So as already been said, my name is Samantha Craigie, and I'm a restoration ecologist based in Sydney, New South Wales, with a specialty in native seed management. So I've been doing this work for a couple of decades now, and I'm really passionate about biodiversity conservation and sustainable land management. I've also been a volunteer firefighter for several decades, and today I'm going to mix my day job with my non-paid day and night job and talk to you about my experience of the Black Summer bushfires in 2019 and 2020. So images like these were broadcast around the world as we battled our longest ever fire campaign, and the impacts were enormous. We had 19 million hectares of land burnt, which is equivalent to 47 million acres. Over 3,000 homes were lost and 33 people died. So it was really a really significant event. All of these photos were taken within about 5 miles of my home, which is a small town called Bilpin, which is 60 miles northwest of Sydney. So 2 photos show the active fire, and the center photo is myself and my sister after a long night on the fire trucks, looking slightly worse for wear. So in Australia, volunteer firefighting is central to the way of life for rural and remote communities. Volunteer firefighters not only attend fires, they provide advice on property management to prepare for fires. They train community members, and we are first responders to incidents like motor vehicle accidents. In 2018, 2019, there were 10 times as many volunteer firefighters as the paid staff. So as you can see from these numbers, our ability to respond effectively to fires in Australia is intrinsically linked to a willingness to stop what you're doing, get on a truck to defend your community. My husband and I have been Rural Fire Service Brigade members since 2001, and in that time we've been on call for emergency responses, engaged in training, trained others, and participated in 4 major campaigns. Our brigade is fortunate to have long-term members and families who've been involved for 3 or 4 generations. This intergenerational knowledge about fire history in our local area gives us insight into potential fire behaviour and fire pathways. My husband is a deputy captain and I'm an AF, or an advanced firefighter. So we both lead crews, but we never go on the same truck because of the risk. This picture is at the front of our fire shed in Bilpin with our category 1 tanker called Bilpin 1 Alpha. This is a very special day for our brigade, and it occurred during the Black Summer campaign. It was our first all-lady crew. So I was the crew leader for the overnight shift that handed over to this excellent group of women, and we were all very proud. So some context on the bushfires. So the top map is the full extent of the fire impacts across Australia from July 2019 to February 2020. Every state and territory across the country was affected. That's 6 states and 2 territories. And as the majority of our population lives along the coastlines, you can see there weren't many communities that were not directly affected by these fires. Next, we'll focus on the Gospers Mountain Fire, which was located in New South Wales, with Sydney being the capital. So we're talking about an area here. So the Gospers Mountain Fire map shows the location of the fire and its proximity to Sydney, which you can see at the bottom of this image here. So this is the Sydney CBD and the harbour area. It's less than 60 miles away from Bilpin, so it's really close. The Gospers Mountain Fire is now known as Australia's largest ever forest fire. Over 500,000 hectares were burnt, and this area includes the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area, that 80% of its range was impacted. Many towns, including Bilpin, were also impacted in this region. So the map also shows these little blue flames. They're multiple ignition points that led to what became labelled as the mega fire. Also important to note that this fire went on to link up with other fires to the south and eventually to burn about 1 million hectares. So really very, very significant. I also wanted to explain how this fire encroached on Sydney. So Bilpin in Sydney's northwest is an important location because we're situated on an elevation of about 600 metres above sea level, and we're located on a sandstone escarpment that surrounds Sydney on 3 sides. So the escarpment drops down onto the Cumberland Plain, which is the area that you can see in this bottom map that's more cleared. And obviously then through to the harbour. Now, if the fire escapes down into those more heavily populated areas on the plain, there is a much greater risk of loss of life and loss of property. So what was different about this campaign? The size of the fires were immense. Because we couldn't put them out, fires tended to run and join up together, creating even bigger fire fronts every time the wind changed. Extreme drought conditions in the years leading up to the fires meant that there was so little moisture in the landscape. Fires were raging in the middle of the night when previously we would have had milder conditions overnight to undertake things like back burns and other mitigating measures. So all these factors really changed the way the fire behaved, meaning approaches that had worked in the past were no longer effective. This changed how I felt. After years of feeling assured that being prepared and equipped would keep us safe where we live, I realised we're not as safe as we thought we were. Every time we have a major campaign, we evacuate our children so we can focus on the firefighting without worrying about their safety. That's usually a decision we make after a lot of consideration because we also don't want to worry them. But next time we'll make that decision sooner because our expectations have changed. Most confronting for me was the realisation that we are less able to manage or put fires out under these climatic conditions than we had been in the past. If this is the new normal, we really have to think and act differently. We also need to work differently to manage assets, threatened species, and important fauna habitats under these conditions. There is much research and work to be done here to find effective future solutions. While we were here, but I also wanted to acknowledge a group of US firefighters who you can see in this image here, who came over to lend a hand. It's always greatly appreciated. And these sorts of experiences create a sort of a global community where there is lots of knowledge and experience to share. And on a last note, and a note of hope, as you can see, we're already starting to train our next generation of firefighters. Here in the bottom corner, these are 3- and 4-year-olds from our local kindergarten. So on that note, I'll hand back to Michelle for the next part of the presentation, if I can.
Thanks so much, Sam, for sharing the very thoughtful and personal perspective on your experiences with the bushfires. Can everybody see my screen? Can you just thumbs up if you can see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, great. Alrighty, hang on. All right. So, still see it? I just changed the perspective here. Okay. So Sam shared some of her personal experiences and the impacts that it had on communities and firefighters and ways that we need to change our thinking about protecting wildlife as well. And we're going to talk about that more. But I'd like to share a little bit about what we've learned over the past year about the impacts that the bushfires have had on wildlife. Just to start off with, I want to point out that Australia has extraordinary biodiversity. It's thought to have 620,000 species. About 70% of the species that we have are yet to be discovered, in addition to that 620,000. It represents 7 to 10% of all species on Earth. And most of those species and ecological communities are found nowhere else. And so the devastating impact that these bushfires have had is not only a loss for Australia, it's a loss for the whole globe. I'm sure you're all familiar with the estimate that was shared last January of 1 billion animals killed in the bushfire. At the time, the scientists that released that estimate had said that it was highly conservative and didn't include some taxa, such as frogs or bats and others, because he didn't have enough data readily available. And of course, the fires continued in the months of February and March. So we knew that that value of 1 billion animals was definitely an underestimate. So the World Wildlife Fund commissioned a study over the course of the year to really assess in a more accurate way what the damage was to wildlife. And that report just came out in December. And the number that they came up with was 3 billion native vertebrates were in the paths of the fires. I say in the paths of the fires rather than were killed, because that estimate is based on abundance data of different taxa in different areas that were impacted by the bushfires. So these animals would have been in the direct path of the fires, but they may or may not have been killed. Some are more able to escape and go to other refugias than others. But we do know that a lot of them would have died, and even those that didn't would have been severely impacted in the weeks and months and probably years following the bushfires. So it included, those 3 billion animals included 143 million mammals, 2.46 billion reptiles, 181 million birds, and 5 million frogs. I'm sure you've all seen the devastating images of our iconic species, kangaroos, koalas, wombats, in the bushfires. And these are the estimates of the toll that the bushfires took on these groups of animals. But there are many lesser known species that were also severely impacted. And I thought I'd just share a few of those with you. I've also enjoyed getting to know the very strange and wonderful wildlife that are here in Australia. So I thought I'd share some of that with you. So in terms of the impacts on mammals, it included 5.5 million bettongs, bandicoots, quokkas, and potoroos. 150 million native rats and mice, 19,000 quolls and Tasmanian devils, 40 million possums and gliders, and 36 million dunarts and other insectivorous marsupials. So that's just a little smattering of the unusual and adorable creatures that were impacted by the bushfires. In terms of the impacts on birds, as I mentioned before, 181 million birds were estimated by BirdLife Australia to be in the path of the fires. BirdLife conducted a spatial analysis of fire overlap with bird distribution data to assess the impacts of the fires on a national scale. And out of that analysis, they identified 17 species as high priority for urgent management actions that needed to take place within the first 12 months after the fires. The eastern ground parrot that occupies heathland habitat is one such species. And BirdLife has assessed that the impacts on native birds are really expected to be considerable and long-lasting. So in addition to those that died immediately in the bushfires, those which survived have struggled to find enough food, water, and shelter in the aftermath of the bushfires. They're more vulnerable to predation by introduced predators like feral cats and foxes. They're experiencing increased competition with introduced herbivores like feral deer and pigs for the remaining unburnt vegetation. And also the changes to the plant community, such as the destruction of trees with hollows. Lots of birds here nest in hollows, and the loss of plants that are old enough to produce fruit, nectar, or cones will also have adverse effects on birds for many years. I wanted to share with you stories of a couple of bird species, just to give you a little taste of what it is these birds are dealing with. I chose the Kangaroo Island glossy black cockatoo as one of those species because some of you may have read about it, and National Audubon Society featured a story about them on their website, on their news stories. These are an endangered subspecies, the glossy black cockatoos that are located on Kangaroo Island. It's a tiny island off of South Australia, close to the city of Adelaide. There's a population, a subpopulation that is considered endangered. It's separated from the mainland population. And they feed almost exclusively on the seeds of the drooping she oak. And they nest in hollows in large old age eucalyptus trees, right? So they have very limited feeding requirements and nesting requirements. And so that very severely limits their population. So they were not doing well at all before the bushfires. It was a very tiny remaining population, and there were recovery efforts underway. And then Kangaroo Island was severely impacted by the fires. 59% of the feeding habitat on Kangaroo Island that's used by 75% of the cockatoos there, right? So 59% of the habitat used by 75% of the birds was destroyed in the bushfires. In addition, 74% of the nests were destroyed, and 93 artificial nest boxes were destroyed. So everyone was really concerned about the mortality that these glossy black cockatoos would have experienced in the bushfires. There were very few of them. Their food was destroyed. Their nesting habitat was destroyed. So they didn't know how many would have made it and whether or not they would be able to reproduce again. I have a bit of good news because every year in October, there's an annual census done of this population. And in this past October, the census found that 452 birds were there. And that was actually a slight increase over the previous year's population. Only one of the flocks suffered high direct mortality. But an interesting thing that they observed is that the birds are now less picky about which she oaks they feed in. So previously, they would be really picky. They wouldn't just feed in any she oak. They would feed in ones that had really high quality food sources and a high abundance of it. So they didn't waste a lot of energy. And what they're finding now is that these birds are much less selective. They're just feeding wherever they can find their food. And so there are concerns about their feeding efficiency and how that might affect their long-term survival and their reproductive success. So recovery efforts are continuing and expanding. They're, of course, planting new she oaks, working with private landowners on Kangaroo Island. They're building more artificial nest boxes to compensate for the loss of hollows, and they're protecting nest boxes from predators. So we'll keep an eye on those ongoing recovery efforts. Another species that I wanted to share with you is the superb lyrebird. I'm sure as birders, many of you are probably familiar with this iconic bird known for its elaborate plumage and courtship display and its extraordinary mimicry abilities. And the populations of superb lyrebirds had previously been secured. They weren't threatened. But BirdLife Australia did an assessment and discovered that about 40% of their habitat was impacted, including rainforest habitat. They tend to occupy rainforests. Those are areas that are not usually burned in our bushfires here. They're not adapted for fires. So there was growing concern about these birds and their habitats, and also they're thought to have very poor ability to escape fires. So there are concerns that their populations may have been severely impacted, and they are exploring maybe changing their listing to a vulnerable status. So with funding by World Wildlife Fund, BirdLife Australia is conducting surveys in order to assess fully the impacts of the bushfires, identify potential important refuge areas that need protection, and identify priority management actions. More broadly speaking, in terms of the recovery efforts and the response to the bushfires, the federal government established a threatened species bushfire recovery expert panel. And that was established in order to assess the impacts of the bushfires on natural assets, to identify species and locations requiring intervention, and to advise on necessary recovery actions. And that took place over the course of this year. You can see the image on the right. I'm not going to go through that, and you probably can't read it, but I just put it up there so you can see the extent of the taxa that were reviewed and the species recovery plans that were recommended. They recommended over 26,000 actions following the bushfires for priority species, and a lot of those priority actions are receiving funding from the federal government. So $200 million was allocated for native wildlife and habitat recovery, $50 million in emergency support immediately following the bushfires, and $150 million are being invested for long-term recovery efforts. Greening Australia was one of the recipients of those emergency recovery funds, which Sam is going to talk about in a moment. And before we share that information with you and how we're spending those funds and what we're working on, I just want to give you a very quick overview of who we are. What is Greening Australia? So our mission is to conserve and restore landscapes at scale through collaborative, science-based, and innovative conservation programs. We're achieving this through by aspiring to some very ambitious goals for 2030. We aspire to plant 500 million plants to restore 330,000 hectares of critical habitat, to support threatened species, and sequester 3.3 million tons of carbon. They spell tons here differently than we do in the United States. That's not me making a spelling error. We'll also be restoring habitat to prevent 400,000 tons of sediment from polluting the Great Barrier Reef, among a number of other ambitious goals that you can see here. And we'll achieve those goals through 5 primary national programs that we're implementing. Our largest program is called Great Southern Landscapes. And we're working with thousands of landholders and partners to integrate large-scale reforestation and carbon sinks into farming systems to create healthy, productive landscapes for farmers and for nature. Another program is called ReefAid. After climate change, water quality is the greatest threat to the Great Barrier Reef. So to prevent sediment from polluting the reef, we're working with landholders, communities, and traditional owners, indigenous communities, to rebuild eroding gullies and restore vital coastal wetlands across the Great Barrier Reef catchment. Tasmania is Australia's last refuge for some of our most critically endangered animals, species that are now virtually extinct on the mainland. So together with landholders, Tasmania Island Arc is working to recreate 15,000 hectares of habitat across the Tasmanian Midlands to create a stronghold for our endangered wildlife and reconnect people and nature while also revitalizing local farming communities. Our Nature and Cities program is kind of like bird-friendly communities, but not just birds, and in Australia. And through that program, we seek to enhance nature and its benefits to people in Australia's cities and suburbs. And our vision is for cool, biodiverse cities with natural waterways and communities interacting with and valuing nature in their neighborhoods. And the last program is called Thriving on Country. We partner with Indigenous communities across Australia to bring together traditional and contemporary knowledge, exchange skills, increase employment opportunities, and support traditional owners to work on their land. So that's an overview of our major programs. And now I'm going to pass it on to Sam to talk about the project that received federal funding in response to the bushfires. And I'm going to stop sharing, and Sam, you can take over.
Thank you. Sorry, slight technical error there. So yeah, thanks very much, Michelle, for giving a bit of an insight into what we're doing here in Australia and how we're sort of trying to affect these environmental changes. Now I'm going to just talk to you a bit about our native seed management project we're currently delivering called Project Phoenix. So as Michelle said, through the Bushfire Expert Panel, our federal government made $50 million available for native wildlife and habitat recovery while the fires were still burning to respond to the immediate impacts of the fire. Mostly this funding was used to supply emergency food stocks to devastated populations of fauna species, some of which we saw in Michelle's presentation. At the same time, we were really pleased to see that the government was also thinking about native seed and the important role that it would have in the recovery of landscapes. Project Phoenix is a response to the bushfire impacts, but we are also using the opportunity to look at systemic issues in the native seed sector and also the potential to scale up the industry to meet increasing demand from natural disaster events and other drivers such as tree planting for carbon sequestration. So we really hardly have a native seed sector in Australia. It's really more of a cottage industry. And we're really trying to take an innovative approach with this project, partnering and engaging with as many people as possible. We want small business owners to be involved. Our First Nations people are incredibly important to this project and to managing country, as are our scientists, policymakers, and seed buyers. So the scale of the impacts and how we need to react is enormous, and we need a response to match. So the project will respond to bushfire impacts. It'll build capacity in the native seed and nursery industry. And importantly, we'll also develop a 10-year native seed and landscape strategy. So 30 individual projects will be delivered under this program that will look to better identify the industry and the participants in it, understand legislation and policies across states and territories, undertake seed collection from threatened plant species in the field, progress the science of seed management, and importantly, to produce training to increase awareness and adoption of best practice native seed management in Australia. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry about that. A little bit too far. So now I'll just give you a little insight into a couple of the projects that we'll be delivering. So the first one we're going to talk about is a national seed production area audit. So seed production areas, or SPAs as we call them, are an important way of supplementing native seed collection from wild areas. So we don't want to be putting pressure on remnant areas, including habitat values for birds and other fauna species, in accessing native seed from the wild for restoration purposes. So we really don't want to be reducing the quality or the composition of natural areas through seed collection. So seed production areas give us a chance to increase seed supply without impacting natural areas. So there's no clarity on the number or the diversity of SPAs in Australia, but there is an increase in seed demand due to the fire impacts and other factors such as that tree planting for carbon sequestration. So this activity will be a point in time study of what the national industry looks like in 2020 to establish baseline data and provide an evidence base for the sector and to enable an assessment of the capacity to upscale. So seems kind of simple, but a really significant step forward for us. So the next project we're going to look at is a little bit more desktop based, and this is bushfire response restoration scenarios. So there's no one size fits all approach to landscape recovery in Australia. As many people would know, Australia is a fire-prone landscape and many species have co-evolved with fire. So every fire or climatic event has a different impact. And even within a vegetation community type, there will be areas with different needs, from just protecting the system and letting it regenerate naturally to targeted restoration of particular species, or to just expanding healthy ecosystems to increase resilience for future fires. So a team of researchers, practitioners, community groups and scientists, led by Greening Australia's Dr. Melinda Pickup and restoration ecologist Team McDonald, are working to develop a framework for restoration in fire-affected communities so that people can know when to intervene and how. So our aim is to synthesise science with practical recommendations to create a framework which can be tailored to different vegetation communities, taking into account a range of variables, including the vegetation composition, the severity of the fire, fire histories, existing habitat condition, and other threats like pests and disease, and also including the landscape context and connectivity. So the models will form part of the 10-year national strategy for native seed, helping to strengthen seed supply chains and increase understanding of this complex ecological resource. Let's see if I can just... There we go. Finally, a lovely connection to the US. I just wanted to let you all know about a conversation we had with a group of inspiring seed managers in the US. You can see the group listed here. They were really generous enough to offer their time and provided insights and sort of key contextual information about the way the US seed strategy emerged. And really highlighted the importance of developing a business plan to recovery to accompany that strategy. They also shared volumes and volumes of work that had been done there by states and regional organisations, which will really help and become sort of templates or tools that we can consider when we're developing our own strategy. We're really very, very pleased and grateful to note as well that they're willing to make this engagement ongoing, and we're really keen to sort of share our reciprocal learnings. So thank you, and back to you, Michelle.
All right. Thank you, Sam. And we'll get to questions in 1 minute. We're almost there. So this last program, I'm just going to share with you briefly. It's not exactly a program that was developed in response to the bushfires, though it is about building climate resiliency in cities. But I wanted to share this because it's sort of another incarnation of the Schoolyard Habitat Program in Connecticut. And because Mononkatuk was so involved in making that program happen, and I see that Taralyn Reynolds is also on the call, and she was the first Schoolyard Habitat manager. So it's really exciting to see you there. So I thought you would enjoy seeing this, and also knowing that a lot of the best practices and lessons learned from the Schoolyard Habitat Program with Audubon, I've been bringing to bear here in Australia. So, so it's growing and expanding across the world. Climate records for New South Wales, that's the state that Sydney is located in, shows clear long-term trends of increasingly warmer temperatures. And as you can see here, 2019 was the hottest year on record. And of course, that provided the conditions for the devastating bushfires. Urban areas are susceptible in addition to the urban heat island effect, and that arises because pavement and other heat absorbing artificial structures make cities hotter than surrounding more natural areas. Urban school grounds, which tend to be dominated by artificial surfaces and low tree cover, are notoriously hot rather than places where kids can engage in healthy physical activity and outdoor learning. This thermal image here shows the extreme differences between open grassy areas and areas that are under tree cover. The red areas are really, really hot, getting up to 60 degrees Celsius, and the blue areas are much cooler. And when you do a comparison of areas that are paved, it's even more striking and extreme. So because of the problem of increasingly hot learning environments and changing climate, and of course loss of biodiversity in urban areas, we launched the Cooling the Schools program in Greater Sydney. It's a 2-year pilot that's being funded by the state of New South Wales. And our goals are to reduce urban heat, increase biodiversity and climate resiliency, create cool outdoor spaces for learning and exploration, and increase knowledge and actions related to climate change and conservation. We're doing this, achieving those goals through a number of activities. The first one I really wanted to share with you in particular, because I know it's not something that we were doing. I don't know what's happening at the moment with Schoolyard Habitat, but it's not something that we were doing with the Schoolyard Habitat program, and it's a really interesting approach. We partnered with a professor at Western Sydney University, and he created what's called a heat vulnerability index for different areas across Greater Sydney. So this is a section of Western Sydney. It's the hottest part of Sydney. And within that, he rated areas based on their heat vulnerability. So it's not just based on air temperature, it's also based on tree canopy cover and what kinds of surfaces are dominant there. And so the blue areas are the cooler areas, and yellow, orange, and red are the hottest areas in Sydney. So we use that as a basis for prioritizing those schools that really needed our help the most in creating canopy cover. We partner with the schools on planting design, and that includes not just shade-bearing trees, but also native understory to provide habitat for bees and butterflies and birds. And also more and more, we're integrating plants that will be resilient in a changing climate. So building that climate resiliency in our city. We offer pre and post planting day lesson plans for teachers to deliver so that students make the connections between what they're doing and climate change and urban heat island effect and biodiversity and the value of urban spaces to make a difference. And then we go out, our educators and field ecologists go out with the kids onto the school grounds and they create these habitats. And then we also invite their families and the larger community to come out and plant at local urban parks in order to create a larger children's urban forest network. The 2-year outcomes are pretty ambitious, but we're going to do it. We're going to be working with 240 schools in Greater Sydney, 84,000 plants planted, 18,000 people engaged in habitat restoration, 12 community planting events. And we hope to demonstrate significant increases in knowledge, attitudes towards conservation and climate change, and intention to take conservation action among students and teachers and their families. So that's a brief overview. I'm happy to talk about it more offline. People are interested, but I think with that we will just open it up to questions. And Dennis, how do you want to do that?
Well, how about if I call on the people that ask questions to ask their questions?
Sounds good.
So the first question was from Bobby Fisher. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi there. I had watched a thing on some nature program where they were talking about this incredible fire and harnessing the attempt to tap into some of the native knowledge about plants and fire in the landscape. Is that something that's being explored?
Sam, you go ahead. Sorry, Sam, do you want to take a first shot at answering that? Can you unmute?
There
she is.
Thank you. Yeah, I just couldn't get myself off mute there. Yeah, look, thanks for the question. Look, Indigenous participation in fire management is really been growing over the last few decades. I mean, one of the problems we have here in Australia, and it's probably a feature that occurs across the world, is that, humans are moving into wilder areas. So it definitely makes managing fire in landscapes more difficult than it was in traditional times. But certainly there is a very strong support and acknowledgement of that traditional knowledge. And techniques such as sort of cool mosaic burns. So one of the problems we have here is it's difficult to put in hazard reductions and things like that. It's difficult to get the right conditions. People are very concerned about fires that escape. So it's really quite hard to get these burns in. But the Indigenous traditions is about burning at specific times of the year, and often burning in mosaic patterns, so not burning large areas, but sort of being really proactive with the management of fire. So there is definitely, growing interest, and I think growing ascendancy and recognition of that knowledge here in Australia.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, you want to ask your question, Aaron Dan? Can you well, let me ask it for her. Is Greening Australia doing collaborative work with Aboriginal groups in Indigenous protected areas?
Michelle, would you like me to take that? Yeah. Greening Australia is really very invested in Indigenous communities. Particularly over the last sort of 5 and 10 years, we've really been trying to partner with Indigenous groups to develop sustainable Indigenous enterprises that are relating to what we call the restoration economy. So building capacity for them to enable a business model that is sort of about intergenerational employment, that is also about working on country. So one of the activities or the projects that we'll be running through Project Phoenix is actually a pilot study to look at what sort of systems and processes could we use as evaluation tools to start to build a business case for Indigenous communities who want to be involved in seed management. So yeah, it's a really important aspect of what we are doing, and an incredibly important aspect of land management in Australia, that ability to share knowledge, that traditional knowledge and the Western science knowledge. So yes, you'll definitely see on the Greening Australia website that we're doing great work in WA, in Queensland, and moving into sort of more urbanised areas in New South Wales, where there are high populations of Indigenous Australians.
I have a question. What do the Australian people think about the relationship between the bushfires last year and climate change, global warming?
Want to take that, Michelle?
I can start, you can add to it. So that report that I was referring to, that federal report that came out on the impacts of the bushfires, and also the Royal Commission, there was a Royal Commission to look at what caused the fires and what actions do we need to take to mitigate future bushfires. And something that really made the headlines was that they said unequivocally the bushfires were due to climate change. That there's all these factors that may have aggravated it, or that we can do to try to mitigate it. But it's very clear that the number one cause is climate change, and that we're going to be seeing an increase in intensity, severity, and frequency of bushfires as the climate continues to warm. So that's the federal government, and this is, we should note that it's a conservative government, and so that kind of statement can come out of the federal government. It doesn't seem like a big deal. Like, it seems like the scientific community should not have a problem making a statement like that, but we know in the United States, that's unfortunately not always the case. So that was an unequivocal response. In terms of day-to-day people, and Sam, you can speak more to that, but just as sort of a new a new immigrant to the country, I feel like I certainly meet climate deniers and people that just see it as part of the, in some of the newspapers, the more conservative newspapers, talk about, that this is not related to climate change. But I definitely, my sense is that way more people are accepting here of climate science than in the United States. And it just seems to be much more respectful of the scientific community and the information that's provided. So that's just as an observer, that's my experience. But Sam, you can share more.
Yeah, look, I would definitely say it was probably the most impactful sort of incident I've seen in my lifetime in Australia. And it really changed people's thinking. I suppose there's not a lot of discussion around climate change in general conversations. Lots of people were either indifferent or didn't necessarily believe. But it was really very interesting to see as the fires just continue to roll on and get exacerbated and move to the next state, the next state, the next state. See, the intensity in the community was really raising. And at the time, our Prime Minister, he was being asked specifically, do you acknowledge that this is due to climate change? And he kept stepping back from that and not wanting to answer that question. But I think the public outcry was just so incredibly forceful that in the end, the government did concede. And like Michelle said, in some ways it seems small, but I think it was actually massive. For somebody like me who's an ecologist and a firefighter, I'm aware of the science, and it was somewhat of a relief in a way to see that so many of the general public could understand that what we were observing was not normal, and if this was the new normal, there had to be reasons for that. So I think it really has shifted a big body of the community into being more aware and wanting action. So, some of the great work that your new president has done in joining the Paris Accord is actually putting pressure on our government now. In the last few days, they've started talking about an inclination towards net zero. Now, this would just be unfathomable 18 months ago. So I think it really has pushed the community forward, and we're starting to see political change, which is great.
Is there any change with the thoughts about the use of coal and the export of coal?
Yeah, well, I suppose, interestingly, and I don't want to get too much off topic here, but I was listening to a report from the solar industry recently, and what they said is there is a citizen-led revolution going on in Australia. So I myself got solar panels on my house just a few months ago, and it is just being taken up at breathtaking speed. So I think, again, we're seeing community action and pressure on governments to not be releasing new areas for mining. It's still a really political issue, but it's wonderful to see this sort of grassroots movement and a transition away from coal-fired power stations.
Perfect. Sharon, you want to come on, unmute yourself and ask your question?
Wait a minute, I keep on, can you hear me now? Okay, yeah.
Yes.
So we have a fabulous group in New England called Pollinator Pathways, and they've been seriously promoting people planting native plants and kind of managing that kind of stuff to promote the growth of bees and insects. And I was wondering what type of challenges you guys have, with bees in particular, before or after the fires. Have you seen or been able to address that in particular? Because they seem to be the basics for getting everything else done.
Well, I'll say what I know. So I don't have any specific data on bees, but the work that we were introduced to at the start, so the work that I've been doing over the last 8 years before Project Phoenix around producing sort of really biodiverse seed production areas down in Western Sydney, we partnered with Western Sydney University as well, and we were a part of a large pollinator project. So this was a $7 million project over multiple countries. And we were really trying to understand what is happening with native and non-native pollinators in our landscapes. And one of the things we were trying to do there was, well, this is sort of the second part of the experiments, is implementing diverse native ground covers in production landscapes so that insects have feeding opportunities outside of those target species. So really thinking about how do we introduce biodiversity into those agricultural landscapes to improve productivity and to maintain habitat for those species as well. So I mean, I can probably follow up, but I think those research group would definitely be looking at what the impacts to insects have been across the fires. So we could probably provide some links if that was of use.
Yeah, and interestingly, the World Wildlife Fund survey did not include invertebrates. So I haven't been able to find like real estimates of or approximates of what the impact is. But I do know that certainly beekeepers have been very impacted by the bushfires, and I've read articles that it's going to take them 20 years to rebuild their honeybee populations, but also native bees were most certainly severely impacted in the fires, and we have similar issues with loss of native bees as you do in the U.S. And there are, and in terms of Sam was talking about more in a rural or less urban environment than I think where a lot of the pollinator pathway projects are. I'm sort of focused a little more in that urban space, and there are similar initiatives going on here, but none quite as organized and well coordinated as what's happening with the pollinator pathway program. So that's one of the things I'm looking at bringing here as well. So it's really great work, and we need something like that here too.
I have another question about seeds. Are you considering local ecotypes when you're gathering seeds and replanting?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, no, that's a really great question. Yeah, I mean, as Michelle was saying, it's a really diverse landscape, and so one of the other things that we are delivering through Project Phoenix is a first look at seed transfer zones. So this is something that you guys have well established in the States, that we don't have any sort of guidelines like that. So there are definitely principles that are used in restoration ecology in Australia that, you know, I suppose 20 years ago, the idea was local was best. But then over the last 20 years, I suppose there's been a lot of development around the genetic understanding of populations and that adaptive potential. So I suppose in sort of general terms, the view is now not only local is best, but also local, diverse, large-scale populations. So we will do things like, so in our urban context, for example, in Western Sydney, where lots of our remnant areas are getting pushed over and used for development, what we tend to do is then pool our seed collections. So rather than just taking a seed collection from one site and using that, we will take that collection and combine it with other local collections so that we are including that genetic potential back into that revegetation, because we definitely want to make sure that the work we're doing will last and has that the ability to adapt to the changing climate. So yes, it's a really important issue. It's definitely one we're all very focused on, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Okay, thank you. Benoko, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so I wondered in the tremendous devastation, whether what is the prognosis for a recovery due to the fires, and do you think the efforts you're making are consistent with the scale of the destruction?
You or me? Oh, okay, I'll say me. Look, I mean, the first 12 months after an event like that are really critical. So I suppose at first we all wanted to kind of rush in and do something. But what we've really learned is that it is also important to take a breath and look and observe and see how the landscapes are responding. So I would say there is not significant reconstruction effort yet, because we're really still trying to assess the damage and understand where to put our resourcing. I think probably, you know, what's on everybody's mind is what comes next. I think, you know, a lot of our sclerophyll forest systems, you know, they're adapted to fire, but high intensity fires at really short frequencies are potentially devastating. So I think it's not only what are we doing directly in terms of managing our landscapes better, but, you know, what we were just talking about, climate change and how we can adapt and how we can reduce the potential future risks.
Thanks.
Does anyone else have a question? I guess not. So
Michelle, do you miss us?
I missed you guys a lot. Yes, it's very hard to be here and know that I can't actually go back. Anybody who's a permanent resident or Australian citizen is not actually allowed to leave the country except for very extreme reasons. So whereas my plan had been to come back twice a year, I haven't been back in a year, and it doesn't look like they're gonna change that policy for another year. So it seems like an interminable period of being away from family and friends and all my beloved Ottawa family. Although I don't miss the snowstorms, and and I'm really grateful that actually we're virtually COVID free here, so we have a lot of freedom, and my heart just goes out to everyone and all the struggles that you all have been experiencing, and I feel some relief knowing that some of you are starting to get your vaccines, and I love watching from afar the work that's going on with Audubon, and I love Ryan is posting everything online, and I still get to feel a little connected to the Audubon Center. So so keep posting. I'm watching and learning, and perhaps we can continue some of these connections. As Sam said, there's a lot that we can learn from the States and probably vice versa. So so it's really great to build these connections.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Thank
Just
you.
to be silly. Here's some snow for you, Michelle.
Excuse me, we're gonna call the meeting to a close. I hope I'll see some of you here next Tuesday for birding the Brooklyn Bridge Park. Michelle.